There was a time in America when childhood came with no warning labels. No liability waivers. No parent hovering 6 inches away with a phone camera and a first aid kit. If you were a kid growing up between the 60s and the 80s, you didn't need a helmet, because nobody had thought to sell you one yet. You just needed a bike, a free afternoon, and a healthy disregard for your own shins. This is the story of what it actually felt like to be a kid in that era, and looking back, it's kind of a miracle any of us made it to adulthood in one piece. Let's start on the roof. Not a metaphor, an actual roof. Before cable television crept into every living room, families depended on a metal antenna bolted to the top of the house, and that antenna needed constant fine-tuning to pull in a watchable picture. So what did a household do when the picture on Channel 4 turned to snow? They sent the kid up there. A 10-year-old, shimmying up a ladder, straddling the peak of the roof, turning a rusty antenna by hand while a parent leaned out the back door shouting instructions like a ground control team talking a pilot through a landing. A little to the left. No, too far. Back. There. Right there. Stop. Don't move. And so the kid would freeze in place, arm outstretched, balanced 2 stories above the driveway, holding perfectly still so the family could finish watching the evening news. Nobody thought twice about it. It was just Tuesday, and when that same kid came down off the roof, sweating in the summer heat, there was really only one place to get a drink of water, the garden hose. Every backyard had one, usually green, usually a little sun-baked and cracked, coiled up by the side of the house. You'd turn the spigot, let it run for a second to clear out the water that had been baking in the sun, and then just drink straight from the nozzle. Nobody worried about what that hose was actually made of, or what might be leaching into the water after sitting in 90-degree heat all day. It didn't matter. It was cold, it was free, and it was there. Today we know that vinyl garden hoses aren't rated for drinking water, that they can carry trace amounts of lead and other things you really don't want to think about, but back then, the hose was basically a second refrigerator, and every kid on the block used it without a second thought. Speaking of hoses, that brings us to the real crown jewel of summer, the slip and slide. A strip of yellow plastic, a hose hooked up to one end, and a running start across the lawn. In theory, it was harmless fun. In practice, it was a long sheet of plastic laid directly over dirt, roots, rocks, and whatever hard patches of grass happened to be underneath it, and kids threw their bodies onto it at full sprint. You'd hit the slick plastic, go flying, and more often than not, skid right off the end onto bare ground. Skinned elbows, bruised hips, the occasional split lip, all just part of the deal, and if the slip and slide wasn't available, there was always the classic oscillating lawn sprinkler, the kind with metal fan blades that spun around flinging water in a wide arc. Kids would run straight through the spray, sometimes clipping bare feet or ankles on those spinning blades without even realizing what had grazed them until later. Nobody stopped the game. You just kept running. Of course, none of this outdoor adventure came with any real sun protection. If sunscreen existed in your house at all, it was probably rated somewhere around SPF 4, which, by today's standards, is barely better than nothing. A lot of families skipped it entirely and reached for baby oil, or a bottle of coconut-scented tanning oil, the kind that basically turned skin into a frying pan. The goal wasn't protection, it was color. A deep, dark summer tan was the badge of a kid who'd had a good vacation. And the sunburns that inevitably followed? Those were treated almost like a rite of passage. You'd hear parents comparing notes on whose kid had the worst peel that week, like it was some kind of contest. Aloe vera plants got rated for their gel, cool baths were run, and then you went right back outside the next day and did it all over again. Now, when the sun finally went down, or when a kid got bored of the yard, it was time to get on a bike, and this is really where Gen X freedom hit its peak. A bike wasn't just a toy, it was a passport. Parents would open the front door in the morning, tell you to be home when the streetlights came on, and that was it. No check-ins, no tracking apps, no idea where you actually were for the next 6 or 8 hours. And what did kids do with that freedom? They built ramps. Real ones, out of scavenged plywood propped up on cinder blocks or stacked bricks, set up in the middle of the street or at the end of a driveway. Then they'd take turns launching themselves and their bikes into the air, trying to clear the ramp, sometimes trying to clear another kid lying flat on the ground just to raise the stakes. No helmets. No knee pads. No elbow pads. Just a kid, a bike, gravity, and the very real possibility of a broken wrist by dinner time. And speaking of bikes, let's talk about the bikes themselves for a second, because even the equipment was a hazard. A lot of those old bicycles came with metal pedals that had sharp, serrated edges, sometimes called bear trap pedals, designed to grip your shoe for better traction. Great in theory. Terrible the moment your foot slipped even slightly, because those metal teeth would rake straight down your shin, leaving a nasty scrape that stung for days. Every kid on the block had at least one shin scar from a pedal slip, and it was worn almost like a badge of honor. If the bike wasn't in use, there was still plenty of trouble to get into right in the yard, thanks to the lawn furniture. Aluminum folding chairs were everywhere in the 70s and 80s, and if you've ever owned one, you know the danger. Those things could snap shut in an instant, catching a careless finger between the hinges like a spring-loaded trap. It happened to nearly everyone at some point. One second you're sitting comfortably, the next you're yelping and shaking your hand because the chair just bit you. Then there was the whole world of backyard toys that, frankly, wouldn't survive 5 minutes on a store shelf today. Lawn darts were sold right alongside croquet sets, actual metal-tipped javelins, waited to fly straight down out of the sky, tossed back and forth by kids standing just a few feet apart. They were eventually pulled from the market after too many serious injuries, but for years, families played rounds of lawn darts in the front yard like it was completely normal. Clackers were another favorite, two hard acrylic balls on a string that you'd swing up and down to smack together, faster and faster, until sometimes one of those balls would shatter mid-swing and send plastic shrapnel flying toward your face. And when kite season rolled around, some kids didn't just want to fly the highest kite, they wanted to win. Which meant coating your kite string with crushed glass or embedding tiny razor blades along it, so that in a kite fight, you could saw straight through an opponent's line and send their kite crashing down. It was aggressive, it was dangerous, and it was treated like a completely ordinary neighborhood pastime. And if kites weren't intense enough, there were the BB gun wars. Loosely organized, entirely unsupervised battles that would break out across a neighborhood, kids ducking behind trees and fences, taking shots at each other with real BB guns, no eye protection, no rules beyond whatever the group made up on the spot. Parents knew it was happening. Some of them had grown up doing the exact same thing. It just wasn't seen as anything worth stopping. Even the simple act of going somewhere in the family car came with its own set of risks. Seatbelts existed, but they weren't routinely worn, and in a lot of states they weren't even legally required until the mid-1980s. Before that, kids rode however they wanted. Standing up in the front seat, bracing against the dashboard on a hard stop. Lying across the rear window ledge in the back of a sedan, staring up at the sky through the glass while the car cruised down the highway. And if the family was hauling something home from the lumberyard, it wasn't unusual to see a kid in the back seat physically holding down a stack of 2x4s sticking out the window, gripping the wood tightly while the wind whipped past, trusting that everything would stay in place until they got home. And on that same drive, there was a very good chance the car was thick with cigarette smoke. Smoking indoors, smoking in the car, smoking basically anywhere, it was just part of daily life, and secondhand smoke was something kids breathed in constantly without anyone thinking twice about it. In fact, kids weren't just around the smoking, they were often part of the supply chain. It wasn't unusual for a parent to hand a child a few dollars, or a handwritten note, and send them into the convenience store alone to buy a pack of cigarettes. The clerk would take one look at the note, maybe glance out the window at the car idling outside, and ring it up without a second thought. A kid, buying cigarettes, for their parent, completely unremarkable at the time. Looking back at all of this now, it's almost hard to believe how much of it was simply accepted as normal. Rooftop antenna adjustments, hose water, sunburns worn like trophies, backyard weaponry disguised as toys, and cars packed with kids and cigarette smoke and no seatbelts in sight. None of it happened because parents didn't care. It happened because that's simply how an entire generation was raised, in a world that hadn't yet decided childhood needed to be padded and monitored and made perfectly safe. Gen X grew up a little bruised, a little sunburned, and more than a little unsupervised, and for better or worse, that's exactly the childhood that shaped them.